Thanks, Damon. All righty. So, autism, a guide for professionals. Okay. So, as usual, and apologies if you are with us every webinar because we have to talk about this every webinar. But a very quick moment on Zoom housekeeping rules. Cameras on or off, I really don't mind. It's evening time. Everybody's in kind of relaxation mode. So do feel free to take your cameras off if you want. But please do keep yourselves on mute at all times unless you are contributing to the Q&A at the end. Just admitting several more people in one go. Okay. Any questions, please do type them into the chat box. If you're anything like me, you will think, oh, yes, I'll know that question. I'll remember that question. And then you'll forget about it at the end. So if you think of anything, pop it in the chat box and then I'll come to it at the end. I think someone's iPhone is writing on my screen, which is quite interesting. I don't know if you guys can see it as well. Never mind, I'll try and do that in a minute. Do come and go as you need. Kids, children, everything else, that all comes first. There we go. Let's get rid of those lines. Okay. And the slides will be emailed to you. So please don't worry about making copious notes. We've got you. Okay. So these webinars are hosted by our Reach Out Early Years Stronger Practice Hub team, and that consists of Damon, Vic, Jess and Lisa. We've got Damon and Lisa online with us tonight joining us. So thank you to them for always turning up and always hosting these wonderful webinars and all the other things that they do. For those who don't know, because there are some new faces here tonight that I don't recognise, Stronger Practice Hubs support early year settings. They improve outcomes of children in the local area across that early years foundation stage. So there are 18 Stronger Practice Hubs across the UK, and our lovely hub is based in Greenstead Green at the Barn Nursery School. So it's funded by the Department for Education as part of the Early Years Education COVID-19 recovery. One thing that we encourage you to have a look at is the Early Years Evidence Store, which is an online resource which has heaps and heaps of evidence for all things across the early years foundation stage, not just speech, language and communication, but all sorts of things like play, English as an additional language, all of those other facets, maths, literacy, to the early years foundation stage. It's very useful if you're a new practitioner and just learning the ropes, but also if you're a more experienced practitioner. So certainly as an experienced practitioner in my field, you can just get into the habit of doing things just because that's the way I've always done them. So if you want to just check that what you're doing really is backed by current evidence, the early years evidence store is the place to go. So do please go and have a little look through that. The Stronger Practice Hub can also offer bespoke support. So again, as I say every time, childcare is not one size fits all, is it? In terms of your children, in terms of your setting, in terms of lots and lots of different things. So if you have a little look through what the hub can offer and you think, oh, none of this is quite what I really need, do get in touch because the hub team can, put together a package for you that will do just what you need it to do. Okay, here's some QR codes which you can scan later to get onto Instagram and socials. There is a lot there. There are giveaways, there's competitions, there's, dates for your diary of all the fully funded free things that the Stronger Practice Hub can do for you. And we're very, very excited because our funding has just been extended for another year. So this was due to be the last speech and language webinar. But actually, we have now got another year and our funding has been extended until March 2026. So we're all very, very happy that we can continue to bring this to you. But enough about that. On to tonight. Now, when I first started this, goodness me, there's people still coming into the webinar. I'm still letting people in. If I look a bit distracted, that might be why. when I first started writing this, I thought this was going to be the last webinar and I was going to have to do a very, very quick whistle stop tour into autism. Now that we have had the funding extended, I have decided to split it into two. Autism is a huge, huge topic and one that I really wanted to do well. So I've taken the decision to split it into theory tonight. So what is autism, its prevalence, how it's diagnosed, a few myths and a few bits of further reading to help you understand the basics of it before coming back in May, because I'm having April off, to thinking about supporting your autistic, either diagnosed or suspected children in early year settings, and also thinking about their language. So tonight's very much the theory, and then the next webinar will be the kind of, and yeah, how do we support these children? So ASD stands for Autism Spectrum Disorder. Okay, autism spectrum disorder. And it comes under that lovely umbrella of neurodiversity, which if you've been to any of my webinars before, you will know that I love to wax lyrical about. So this is all of those conditions like dyslexia, ADHD, developmental language disorder, dyscalculia, dyslexia, all of these things where the brain works in a way that is not typical to the majority of the population. Okay, so ASD and ADHD are probably your two headliners there, the ones that everybody kind of feels that they know about and has seen. And we've done an ADHD webinar because I'm the mum of an ADHD daughter. And today we're going to look at the ASD side of things because it's very likely that I am the mum of an autistic child too. So the definition then of ASD is that autism spectrum disorder is a neurological and developmental disorder that affects how people interact with others, communicate, learn, and behave. So although it can be diagnosed at any age, it is described as a developmental disorder because generally those symptoms occur and appear and are noticed within the first 2 years of life, but not always. And that comes from the National Institute of Mental Health. So that's the wordy definition, but we're going to dive deeper into that now. But I wanted first to have a little think about naming conventions. So I saw a post on Instagram, I think it was yesterday actually, saying if your therapist uses the term autism spectrum disorder, it's not particularly neuroaffirming. So as we move towards this affirming approach for neurodiversity, rather than trying to fix neurodivergent children or turn them into a neurotypical child, we're starting to challenge the use of the word disorder. We know that different types of brains need to be celebrated and not fixed or classed as disordered. And actually, people were saying, is it a red flag if your therapist uses the word disorder? I don't know, but certainly the kinder term that we're using now or moving towards is ASC. So autism spectrum conditions. I think that sounds much nicer, and I'm going to try and use that more. You'll notice that my slides do talk about ASD. That is because I'm using diagnostic criteria tonight. And because that is being lifted from a formal document, I've got to stick with their terminology. But my personal preference would be for autism spectrum condition. I'd be interested to know what you think about that move towards it. I think it's much nicer, much more affirming, much kinder. So the prevalence of autism then. So it's estimated that 1 in every 100 children in the UK has autism. And there, within that, 4 times as many boys are being diagnosed than girls. Now, the reason for that is probably that girls are super at masking their autistic traits and very, very often fall through the net. So diagnosis rates have increased over the years, but many children with autism still remain undetected. And there was a study in Cambridge, so very close to me, led by Professor Simon Baron-Cohen. Yes, the brother of Sacha Baron Cohen, Ali G. For those of you who are thinking, is it? Yes, it is. They found that for every 3 children who have been diagnosed with autism, there's 2 more who have it but haven't been given a formal diagnosis. So therefore, if you do the maths, that's an additional 300,000 children who have autism who haven't yet been identified. Now, what I also hear a lot of is, isn't everybody a little bit autistic? No. And hopefully, once we've been through the diagnostics, you'll see why that's not the case. People are also saying to me, there's so many children with autism now. There's so many. Why are there so many? All the children have got autism. Isn't it just bad parenting? I think we're just better at knowing what it is. We're better at diagnosing, we're better at recognizing, we're better at supporting. And that is a good thing and something that should be encouraged. So I don't think it's that there's more children with autism, it's that we are getting much better at recognizing these children, identifying them, and picking them up where they need help. And that is a good thing. So who diagnoses autism then? Which professionals are involved? So a specialist team usually come together to diagnose autism. It shouldn't be done by just one person. It really should be done by a multidisciplinary team. And that team should always include a paediatrician and or a child adolescent psychiatrist, should always have a speech and language therapist on board, and a psychologist who has experience of working with autism. It would also be beneficial to have access to paediatricians or paediatric neurologists. So I actually work as a speech and language therapist with a team who diagnose autism in Cambridge. So my role there is to play a part into that diagnostic team as well. So, what is autism? We went through the wordy bit, but what does that really mean? So, it's basically a neurodevelopmental disability that is comprised of patterns of differences, in 3 key areas. They are language and communication, socialization, interests, routines, and sensory processing. So, let's kind of have a little bit of a look into that. For those of you who saw my ADHD webinar, you will recognize this slide. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. It's not a very nice title, but the DSM-5 is the Bible of diagnostic criteria for neurodiverse and any kind of neurological disorder. So this is kind of the diagnostic criteria that all doctors will be looking at when they are thinking about whether a child meets criteria to be diagnosed with autism. And I found these absolutely glorious slides from Neurodivergent Insights, who have basically taken the diagnostic criteria for the DSM-5 and made them really, really accessible and really, really much more simple to read. So if we look at criteria, and the only thing they've changed, and I love that they've changed this, is that they've crossed out the word deficit and replaced it with differences. And I think that's brilliant. We don't need to change the criteria necessarily, but let's put it in a more neuro-affirming way. So criteria A, we are looking for persistent differences in social communication and interaction across multiple contexts. Okay, so multiple contexts, we're looking at home life, school life, after school clubs, church, football, lots of different contexts. Are these features present in all of them? Okay, so we're looking really, we have to meet these 3 criteria. There have to be differences in social and emotional reciprocity communication, differences in non-verbal communicative behaviors, and differences in developing, maintaining, and understanding relationships. Now, these guys have done, again, a super job at giving us some examples. So if we look at that first subcategory, so those differences in social emotional reciprocity. So do they speak in kind of a monotone voice or a flat voice? Do they have difficulty initiating conversation if it's outside of their area of interest? So a lot of autistic children and adults have really specific interests that they are obsessed by. It's called a hyperfocus. And they really, really love to talk about this. We call it info dumping. They just come along and they dump a load of information about the thing they love the most. I've got a little boy who I know, it's post boxes. Loves a post box, can tell you anything you want to know about post boxes. Flags is another one. I've worked with lots of autistic children who love flags, and they will come and tell you everything about that. If it's just making general, what you or I would call small talk, that is almost impossible to initiate. Oh gosh, I've preempted my next point, difficulty with small talk. They may use kind of pre-scripted lines that they've been taught to use, like, hello, isn't it a lovely day today? Or hello, isn't the weather glorious? Because they kind of have observed or been taught that that's the way to start a conversation. Um, Also difficulties with back and forth criteria. So looking at differences in that non-verbal communicative behavior. So they might not understand body language. They very often don't pick up on the cues that I might be giving. If a child is info dumping at me and I'm going, not that I would, but imagine I was going, they won't read that. They find it very difficult to know what we're trying to explain non-verbally. There's very little facial expression, very little body gesture. There is often, but not always, a dislike of eye contact. Verbal and non-verbal presentation can be fragmented. So they might be telling you something really, really happy, but have a really flat face. So it might just kind of not all match up together. Very often tone or volume can also be, off whack with these children. They just find it very difficult to moderate. A3 then, thinking about understanding and maintaining relationships. They find it very difficult to initiate and develop friendships with people who are allistic. So that is non-autistic. You tend to find that autistic children gravitate to each other and they have the best friendships. It is the best friendships. They talk about their hyper focuses, they info dump on each other, they just talk and they are glorious. I often say, I think back, I've been a therapist for 20 years and I spent a lot of time trying to get autistic children to be neurotypical, sort of in my first sort of 10, 12 years of practice. And we used to say, no, you shouldn't do it like that. You should do it like this. Why? These autistic children, they get together and they have just the best time. Who are we to stop that? Okay. So really have a think about that. They do have difficulty maintaining friendships, though. Those ebbs and flows that friendships have and those moments, those bumps along the road are very hard to navigate. Difficulty with shared imaginative play or shared group projects once they're older. That can be very, very tricky to navigate. And they have very, very hard time context shifting. So once they're in, they're in. And if you try and move it around, that can be quite dysregulating and quite upsetting for autistic children without a really good transition into moving that conversation along. So moving into criteria B, which if you'll remember is that restricted, repetitive patterns of behavior, interests or activities. So we're looking at so they need to meet two of these four to meet criteria B. So stereotyped or repetitive motor movement. So we often call this stimming. So the classic stimming is flapping hands. Okay. Now, gone are the days where we say quiet hands. Okay. We now say, yes, if you want to stim, you absolutely stim. If that keeps you regulated, that's fine. They may be spinning. It can be much smaller movements. It can be little finger movements in front of the eyes, a kind of visual stim. That's one that I see a lot of. So any kind of repetitive movement that regulates the child. They can be echolalic, and we've done a webinar on echolalia and Gestalt language processing, although I shall probably recap some in the next webinar. So they reuse phrases repetitively. They might be walking around saying something like, what did I have? Hey, Dougie, time to tidy up. Or roly tidy up, roly tidy up, roly tidy up. They might be repeating that over and over because it regulates them. There's also kind of lining up and organizing things as well. And these all self-soothe. They're really regulating for a child. So if you see a child lining things up, let them, because that's regulating them. It's regulating them. We all need things to regulate us, and you'd hate it if someone came along and undid all of that. So just be mindful of that. B2 is insistent on sameness, really, really inflexible, ritualized patterns. So finding security in routines, finding it hard when plans change. Now, these can be anything like, well, tomorrow's World Book Day, isn't it? So tomorrow's World Book Day, there's going to be people in costumes, peers and adults in costumes. And for some autistic children, that is their idea of hell. So these things can really throw children out. It can even be something as small as if you are a male practitioner and you grow a beard. This is also something that can throw children off, changing staff, changing decoration in the setting. All of these things can really be quite disturbing for these children, or distressing rather. B3, highly restricted, fixated interests that are abnormal in intensity or focus. That's your post boxes, flags, all sorts of things that can be. It can be things like Minecraft and Roblox. That's quite a common one at the moment with your sort of 6, 7, 8-year-olds. But it's normally ones where you think, oh, that's unusual for a child of that age, and kind of all topics return back. If you try and change the topic, the child will always try and steer it back again. There's also hyper or hypo reactivity to sensory input. So you can have people who are sensitive to light, sound, touch, food, textures, or those who need more of it. So it can go one way or the other, but there will be some sensory differences. C, D, and E also have to be present. So traits, again, we've moved away from symptoms and we prefer to use the word traits. They must be present in early developmental period. You might not be able to see it until the child reaches a point where they can't hide it anymore. Traits cause an impairment in social, occupational, or other important areas of current functioning. So these autistic traits need to be kind of getting in the way of things a little bit. And also criteria E is that they're not better explained by something else. So that there's not a better explanation like global developmental delay or a learning difficulty. So I think having looked through them, you can see why it needs a multidisciplinary team to be looking into it. So as a speech and language therapist, I will be looking at, is there a significant language deficit that can be causing some of these things, or is it caused more likely by a neurodevelopmental, by an autism? So let's have a look at what that looks like functionally. So what are you going to be seeing in your children? Now, Mrs. Speechy P, if you're on Instagram or Facebook, please, 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 please follow her. So she's an American speech and language pathologist or speech and language therapist, who is recently diagnosed as autistic herself. She is just wonderful. She's given me permission to use slides on my webinars, and she's just great. And you will get all sorts of information from following her. So please go and find her on Facebook or Instagram. So what you're going to be seeing as practitioners in terms of communication is delayed speaking or loss of words. So very often parents come to me going, well, they were speaking, it was all going fine, and then it all regressed around the age of 12 to 18 months. And that's what breaks parents' hearts, is when everything doesn't just stop, but it goes. And that can be really, really upsetting for parents. You may see echolalia or scripting. They're strong on nouns, strong on letters, strong on numbers. Children who are autistic can very often count to 20, 30, 40, 50, say their alphabet, but find more functional vocabulary quite tricky. They might use unusual words or pronunciations. Very often a high-pitched voice is present in children who are autistic. They use words over and over and over, and they take things very literally. That idiomatic language, like pull your socks up, can be very, very tricky for them. In terms of socialization, you're looking out for inconsistent eye contact. Again, not all the time. I know some children who make beautiful eye contact who are autistic. So don't use that as your real yardstick. Look at everything together. They have a preference to play alone or with adults. They very much prefer communicating with adults. Very decreased joint attention. They do look for attention and affection from strangers, which obviously is a safety issue. They struggle to make and keep friends. They can have either flat or very exaggerated facial expressions. And very often their topics, they change, they interrupt, they info dump, or all of that kind of real heavy topic leaning. In terms of interest, routine, and sensory, they have a preference for sameness. We like to keep it all the same as possible. If every day was the same, it would be brilliant. Play is sort of unexpected. It's repeated. It's copied. It does the same thing every time. Strongly preferred topics and toys. Focuses very much on details and perfection. These are your children who will make one tiny mistake with their drawing and rip it up because it's just ruined. That's ruined it, and we can't get past that. Sensitivities for sound, light, taste, or touch. Again, either not wanting any or wanting too much. These children will either generally eat mushy, bland food or eat really crunchy food because that gives them that kind of sensory input that they need. Repeated movements, flapping, jumping, spinning, rocking, all of that stimming. And also they really do dislike their hygiene routines as well. So that's another little one that you can look for. Another thing that we're now learning is that the autism spectrum isn't linear. It looks more like these circles at the bottom where it's very, very multifaceted. You're looking at social differences, interests, repetitions, sensory sensitivities. So, for example, a child that I know has the most brilliant speech and language, brilliant speech and language. Emotional regulation, though, dreadful. And executive functioning, very, very poor. Also, great speech and language, but often says, why would they do that? Why would they do that? Because it's those nuances, it's that subtlety of communication that we know, but doesn't always make sense to children. We now do not use terms like high functioning or low functioning. Okay, they're harmful and they're outdated. Autism is autism. Okay, so we also don't use the term Asperger's anymore because Dr. Asperger was a very nasty man in the war. So if you go and want to Google that, Google that. But we're trying, it is an uphill battle. It's a very, very uphill battle, but we're trying not to use those three terms anymore. High functioning, low functioning, and Asperger's. Try and find something different. Talk about the profile of needs rather than trying to put the child in a box of sort of how autistic they are. There are many autism myths that Mrs. Speechy P has. Oh, got no way of talking tonight. So it's always easy to identify autism. It isn't. Sometimes you really have to delve deep, and parents are often key to this because very often a child will present differently in one setting than another. All autistic people are antisocial. No, autistic people are not antisocial. They often need to find their tribe, and then you see this spark, and it's the most wonderful, wonderful thing. So they just find neurotypical communication quite difficult. So we need to be mindful of that. Autistic people never make eye contact. No, absolute myth. Some autistic people never make eye contact. Some autistic people find eye contact distressing and physically painful, which is why we should never, never, never force eye contact. Please, 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 if you are given an eye contact goal by somebody, just ignore it, because actually you could be causing real distress. Think to yourself, who is eye contact for? Who does it help? It's just something we do to show a child is listening. But actually, most autistic people prefer not to make eye contact. And if they are making eye contact, then their listening is actually compromised, because they're so concerned with making the eye contact that everything they've got is working towards, am I doing this right? Is this enough? Sometimes you can get a really big stare going on because the autistic child or adult doesn't know how much eye contact to give. Autism only impacts boys. Again, we've touched on this. It impacts girls and boys. Girls are just better at masking it, significantly better at masking it. Luckily, we're now getting better at recognizing how girls present. Autistic kids don't make progress. Absolutely not. So if any of you have seen my webinars or in-person conferences before, I worked with a gorgeous girl called Matilda, who only spoke in scripts when I met her, large chunks of hey Dougie, and scripts that mum and I would go, no idea where that's from. Well, today she came in and she said, oh, Becky, a pancake, because we had a pancake craft going on. I said, yes. She went, oh, good. I love pancakes. She is now getting ready for school and she has spontaneous language. She'll say, can we play this together? And it's wonderful. They do make progress. And if you tap in the right way, it can be glorious. Autistic people don't have empathy. Very often they are some of the most empathetic children you will ever meet. And I've seen the one person who's still got a camera on giving it a nod. Well done. Yes, they do. They are so empathetic. They sometimes just don't know how to show it. So all autistic kids do anything? No. I've got a wonderful slide on one of my other webinars that says, if you've met one autistic person, you've met one autistic person, because they are all different and all wonderful. There's not a one size fits all to this, and everybody needs to get that out of their heads. So this is very often how autism is portrayed by the media, just in the same way that all ADHD kids throw chairs across the classroom. No, they don't. It doesn't always look like that. It can look like the most wonderful thing. It can look lonely. It can look difficult, but it can look great. If we've got our ear defenders on and we've got some accommodations in our environment, we can be happy and doing all the other things that the other children do. Our goal as practitioners is to support kids as they are and not change them to be less autistic. Just let that sink in for a moment. And again, when I look back on some of the children that I've worked with the evidence that I had at the time, my heart breaks, because I was teaching them to be less autistic. The best thing we can do as practitioners now, particularly if we've been doing it for a long time, is get up to speed with the current evidence and change our practice now for the children going forward. There's nothing we can do about what we did before. We need to educate ourselves to what's going on now. Further reading then, because you have got a little bit of time between this and the next one. You don't have to do it. It's not a course, but if you'd like to go and find some reading and you have some time, the National Autistic Society. I mean, it's obviously going to be the first port of call. They have got a lovely section for professional practice. So it's written by professionals and autistic people. We must listen to autistic voices. We are now having autistic people growing up into young adulthood and adulthood who are able to write about and reflect on their experiences as autistic children. These are incredibly valuable and must be listened to and honoured. So I had a little look. I typed in early years into their search bar and found things like toileting and autistic children, top 5 autism tips for supporting preschool children. Or emotion works, so helping autistic children to recognize and understand their emotions. So there's a lot there to go and have a little look at, that might be sort of well worth doing for you. Blossom. Now, I remember Blossom as a parent of a child in nursery, and I used to get all my stuff on Blossom about my children. And Blossom have got an absolutely lovely article here about how to make your nursery autism friendly. Now, remember, the children do not have to have a diagnosis. If you suspect a child in your setting is autistic, don't wait, put the accommodations in, because if they work, happy days. It's going to make your life easier and their life easier. So don't wait for a diagnosis. People often think they need permission. No, if you think it might work, have a go. This is also, I kind of screen grabbed this, but I've gone back to it time and time again when writing this webinar and the next bit. So Neurodivergence Wales has done Autism, a guide for early years settings. So it is a PDF to read through, but it's got an awful lot of information about, as it says on the tin, I guess, about autism, about sort of the background, what it is, how it affects children, and how to make your setting autism friendly. So those are some really good resources. So coming up in May on the 14th and the 20th is Autism, ASD, ASC. I'm going to change the title. I'm going to come away from ASD. Autism in early years, supporting autistic children in the early years setting. So join me for that one, where we'll go through actually, if I've got an autistic child in my setting, how can I best support them? But hopefully that has been helpful to you. So what we'll do now is we'll stop the recording and we will come out of the slides and we will do a Q&A. Okay, so hopefully we can get that recording stopped now. This is where we find out that Damon's not away.